I'm Jim Knight, co-founder of the Instructional Coaching Group, and you're listening to Coaching Conversations, where I talk with coaching experts from around the world so that all of us can learn better ways to make an unmistakably positive impact on the people around us. Suzy, it's great to see you. It's been a while since we've been together, and we've been together in lots of different places, but welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited to have you here.
I'm so excited to be here, Jim, and to do a little bit of positive reminiscing, as we call it in positive psychology.
Oh, I like that positive reminiscing. That sounds good. That's good.
Absolutely.
I think it's a good time for that. Now, you may not know the full extent of how your life has changed my life, but I want to fill you in. We first met, I think it was in 2011. Jonathan Passmore set up this coaching and education conference. Christian Van Nieuwerburg was there. That was the first time I met
That's
Christian.
right.
Sir John Whitmore was presenting. You were presenting.
That's
We were
right.
presenting. And then after we met there, you invited me to Australia to present at I think it was the first positive psychology conference you facilitated. And I gave a keynote, and John Campbell knew that I was coming to present at that conference. So he invited me.
Right.
I'd never heard of John. He invited me to go and do a little talk with him in Sydney. I
Right.
actually did it with one of his colleagues. He was in New Zealand. And then John came to Kansas. And then Christian came to Kansas. And now John and I have emerged. So growth coaching is a part of the instructional coaching group, and
Fantastic.
Christian's a part of both organizations. So that day
That's
together in Australia
amazing.
transformed my life. My best friend probably is John Campbell. And if it's not him, it's Christian
Oh,
Van Nuremberg,
how
all
beautiful.
because we came together. So look at the positive. There's a little positive reminiscing for you right there.
It's a beautiful reminiscing, and they're two beautiful people, Christian and John, and yourself included, beautiful, kind-hearted people. And that event too, I have a couple of memories. One was definitely meeting Sir John Whitmore, and we had an interesting follow-up series of emails, and then we ended up meeting, and we had afternoon tea at Charing Cross Hotel in London, and I actually formed a really beautiful connection with John, and as we know, he sadly passed away, as some of the greats have now in coaching, early coaching psychology and coaching. But the other memory I have, Jim, was when we went out for dinner prior to the conference, and I often still tell this as a bit of a joke. It's not entirely correct, but I usually say there was an Englishman, an Australian, or an Australian woman, and an American, but in fact you're Canadian. And I'd say, we're all having a debate around coaching versus therapy. And the Englishman says, "Oh no, we have to have therapy, very separate from coaching. We don't mix them up." And then and then I said, "Oh, no, I'm a bit more flexible around that. It really depends on the individual and the situation." And then the American, which of course you're not, you're a Canadian, but was like, "Oh God, we do everything. You can have all sorts of things, therapy, coaching, everything." So it's a bit of a twist on that actual conversation, but I think, things have certainly developed since that conversation also.
I do remember that conversation. In fact, I was surprised at how uh, uninterested the Englishmen were in the concept of therapy, which in North America, I'd say is pretty common practice. But there was like, no, we don't do therapy. But it
Oh,
was
good.
pretty interesting and huge. Probably one of the most important days of my life. If you stacked up 50 important days, it would be near the top of the
Yes.
list in terms of how my life has evolved and what's happened. But Susie, people might
Amazing.
not know as much about you as I do.
Yeah.
So would
Yeah.
you be able to share just a little bit about you,
Yeah.
who you are and why you're here?
Yeah, well, it's been a long journey for me, Jim, and I think at this stage, I mean, I've known for a while, but I absolutely believe I've had a calling, and the work that I've done and the people that I've met and the community that we're all part of, we're here to do a job on this planet. That's how I feel. And so, I mean, I know you spent a lot of your time in education, so I think I haven't really shared this story most of my life, but most people don't know that I left school when I was 16,
Mm.
and no one in my family had attended university. There was no encouragement for me to go to university. It was get married, have kids, which was beautiful, and I did that. Unfortunately, I went through a divorce in my early 30s, late 20s, I think it was early 30s. But my first husband, or my ex-husband, actually was the person that encouraged me to go to university. And so he did medicine and was studying psychiatry, and so I was just intrigued and so interested in the topic and the stories that he would tell. So I ended up doing psychology, but it was a very long journey because I was bringing up two children at the same time. So it was like 10 years and two children later, I came out with a doctorate in clinical psychology. And I did come the clinical path because of my ex coming from psychiatry, and I worked in a psychiatric clinic was my first job. And that was so formative even to today because I have a very good understanding and experience of what it's like for people across the realm of mental ill health right through to thriving, if you like. And so I'm very grateful that I went down the clinical path, but I knew very early on it wasn't going to be me. And I was very, very fortunate. And again, no synchronicity or, it was meant to be, but I met the incredible Professor Anthony, the late, great Professor Anthony Grant, who became my secondary supervisor on my doctorate on coaching. And my doctorate was the first doctorate on evidence-based life coaching at the time. And that it was the first Australian study published in the Journal of Positive Psychology, because not only were we showing that coaching had an impact on goal striving, but it had an impact, a very positive impact on psychological well-being and also reduction of mental ill health like depression, anxiety, and stress. And so I still did a bit of clinical work for a while, but I moved very quickly into coaching, executive coaching, was doing work in the corporate. But in one of my classes at Sydney Uni, I had a school counsellor in one of my very early classes actually, and she was nodding and smiling. And when she came up to me and she said, "Oh, I've just started a new job, and the reason the principal has, gave me the job is because I was doing this coaching masters," she said, and the principal had been to Harvard and is aware of coaching. And so long story short, I ended up doing another randomized controlled trial on evidence-based coaching for senior high school students. That was Green Grant Rhinesard, I think is the reference. And then after that, we did another randomized controlled trial with the teachers, because the teachers said, we need this more than the students. So we were also able to show positive impacts, not just on goal striving, but on well-being. So for me, coaching's always been a well-being initiative or intervention, if you like. Although when I came into it, particularly in the corporate sector, it was very performance focused. But now with COVID and here in Australia, you probably are aware that we are the first country to have legislation for psychological health and safety across the country. Except Victoria's hasn't completely aligned, but it does have its own code of conduct. And so now there's permission within organisations and in schools I'm aware of, because there's this, as I said, legislation around psych health and safety. And as you know, coaching for me is not about achievement, performance per se. It's about developing relationships with people, having quality conversations with people, and all of that can actually prevent all of the psychosocial hazards that often disruptions in relationships or bullying and harassment. And there's a number of those psychosocial hazards that actually could be counteracted by developing positive relationships, which, as I said, coaching for me is a large part is what coaching's about.
Well, that Tony Grant is one of those people who has touched so many people's lives. Claudia Oad, of course, well, you
Yes,
would know
dear
her
friend
very well,
Claudia.
but
Yes.
she was deeply influenced. I mean, John Campbell is deeply influenced by Tony Grant, and
Yeah.
in the country of Australia, I would say he's a hero when it comes to the helping develop and spread the whole power of coaching. I think he affected me through the people he affected.
Absolutely. Has such a lasting legacy. And because the coaching psychology unit, which was the first one globally here at Sydney University, which Tony and Michael Kavanagh started, that continues, 24 years on. And so what it's also done is it's really helped mature the coaching industry here in Australia, and I would say even globally, by bringing that rigor and that evidence base, which is what Tony was. He's known as the founding father of coaching psychology, and of course, John Whitmore. So John is known as the founding father of coaching.
Okay, so I don't mean to separate these two things out, but I think we have to talk in kind of a
Yes.
linear way. So tell me about the attraction of positive psychology.
Yeah.
What pulled you into that?
I think, well, I think if I go back to, even my childhood and my adolescence, I've been blessed genetically, I guess, with a fairly robust mood, Jim. I was also brought up in a very stable family. And I do feel like that gift and that privilege that I've had allows me to do the work that I do. And I was also given, and interesting, there's a great little educational story. One of my, well, when you ask to reflect on your favorite teacher or the teacher that really saw you and saw your strengths was Mrs. Rowley. And I had her for 2 years in a row, I think year 4 and year 5. And she used to call me Sunshine Susie, Jim. So she'd say, when you come into the classroom, you light up the whole classroom, Susie. And at the time that like I didn't realize that it's actually a strength and a gift that I have. And when you look at the VIA character strengths assessment, which millions and millions of people have taken globally now, zest, energy, and vitality is my top strength. I do have to tell you, as I'm getting a little bit older, that my naps, I have to ramp up my 3 p.m. naps if I want to sustain that zest and energy. But I do have a natural energy and a hopefulness and an optimism. So it seemed to be the perfect fit for me. And, after coming out of a clin psych doctorate where all we did was study fear, anger, shame, disgust, and guilt, like, which is important and they're all important emotions, but we never had lectures on love or joy or gratitude. So when I became aware of pos psych, which it was just emerging as coaching psychology was emerging, it was like, oh my goodness, I found this is me. This is the stuff I'm interested in. But as I said, I'm still glad I've come the clinical path. And in fact, I'm actually come full circle and I'm really interested now from an adult development perspective, which perhaps we might talk about today too, around, I guess, trauma and the impact of trauma on people's development and neurodivergence. So I've really feel like I've come quite full circle from clinical, pos psych and back, and it's all sort of becoming more holistic and integrated for me now.
So can I adopt that Susie Sunshine? Can that be kind of my nickname for you? Are you okay with that?
Absolutely.
You don't feel I don't wanna, give a nickname you don't like, but I like Susie Sunshine. That sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
So we'll go into those things, but just for the sake of giving us a context for our conversation, could you say a bit about kind of what we mean by positive psychology and some of the key elements of it?
Yes, so there are a number of definitions. My favorite that I always stick to is it's the science of the conditions and processes uh, that lead to optimal human functioning. So it's really about optimal human functioning, us at our best. Um, what Maslow would have referred to as self-actualization. And so positive psychology does sit on the shoulders of the greats like Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, for example. But it's brought a lot of rigor to some of these topics, which were really, when humanistic psychology was around in the 50s and 60s, we didn't have the rigor of scientific research methodology or statistical analyses. And so, what Marty Seligman and others have done is to bring more rigor to these topics like hope, which again in Kansas, I was very fortunate to meet both of the founding fathers of hope theory, Snyder and Lopez, who again sadly passed away now. So it's brought a lot more rigor. But in saying that, Jim, I just will say, because I just gave a presentation recently based on a really critical paper that's come out by a Canadian actually, and I'm having a mental blank as to her name, Elizabeth Dunn, the University of British Columbia, and she did a review of positive psychology interventions or happiness interventions. And she was quite critical in as much as majority of them, I think there were around 6,000, there were only around, goodness, 65 studies, I think, in total that had been pre-registered. Now, this is a fairly new, you're probably becoming familiar with this from a research perspective. It's a fairly new move for researchers and academics to pre-register their research methodology, what statistical analysis they're going to use prior to conducting the research. Because what we've known has happened, and it's termed p-hacking, where researchers have, adjusted, taken, removed outliers, whatever they've done statistically, report or not reported non-significant findings, which of course many journal articles, they wouldn't even publish a non-significant finding years ago. But there seems to be a whole new movement to bring much more rigor. But based on Elizabeth Dunn's research, we've got a lot more rigorous research to be done. Like, for example, gratitude is one of the most widely researched constructs in positive psychology. And I think there was only one or two of these pre-registered studies that are very rigorous. And you could actually say, we can actually, like, this is actually saying something, So it's a bit of a change happening within the field.
So broadly speaking, with positive psychology, I've worked from Seligman's model of PERMA.
Yes,
The idea of
yes,
positive experiences, engagement, which probably goes back to Csikszentmihalyi. We used to call him the Flow Meister because we couldn't say his
yes.
name.
That's him. That's him.
And then relationships, meaning accomplishment. What would you say to just sort of expand that vision? What are some things that you would add to that, maybe?
Wow, you've caught me at a good time because I just heard a PhD presentation yesterday by Annalise Rowe. She's a New Zealander on lay definitions of well-being. And it was really interesting. I won't have time to go into detail, but what I will say is it's really enlarged. It will enlarge, I believe, academic definitions going forward of what well-being is. And if you look at PERMA, a lot of that is very mental or cognitive. I mean, a lot of people have added the H for health or V for vitality. So we have seen a movement towards acknowledging physical health, but some of Annalise's research was recognizing the importance of financial well-being. So again, we're looking at a broader concept of well-being, but positive psych, because of where it's come from, which is psychology, it has primarily focused on psychological well-being. And I have been a huge, I guess, fan of it because as a clinical psychologist, I spent years treating people reactively after, curveballs had come or life stressors had knocked them down, and they didn't have any psychological skills, or most of them didn't, I would say, because children weren't learning them at school. Most parents weren't equipped with them. And so a large part of my work in the field of positive education has been around educating educators around these key psychological capabilities. And I've created my own model, which is a 6M, and there are 6 psychological capabilities such as mindset, mindfulness, mood, meaning, might, and I can't recall the motivation is the other one. I think so. So I'm really passionate because pos psych in many ways is about being proactive and how do we equip people with these skills prior to life challenges happening. Now, will it prevent every episode of mental ill health by learning these capabilities? Possibly not. But why wouldn't you be teaching these skills in school to kids? And having, as you know, Jim, I've had the privilege of working in schools for probably since about 2008 or even earlier with my research. It does make a difference. And the schools that I've worked with, particularly schools where it's a K to 12 and they're teaching kids, and in the US in particular, you've probably been doing it a lot better than us around social and emotional skills. It wasn't, even today, it's not commonplace to have that in all public schools. Um, but in the schools that I worked with, where the kids had learnt these social and emotional psychological capability skills, I would argue, when the other children come in at sort of that senior high school mark, the teachers have said to me, it's visibly obvious the kids that have had the education from K to year 6 is our year levels here in Australia, and the children that have come in from schools that haven't, it's so obvious in terms of how they self-manage and how they manage their relationships when they haven't learnt those skills early on.
So it sounds like, correct me if I've got this wrong, and I could have it wrong, so please jump in. But
Yeah.
it sounds like if we sort of adopt a little bit of Shane Lopez's hope framework, that
Mm.
well-being is the preferred future and positive psychology is the pathway to the preferred future. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does, and I guess, it starts to get a bit complex because
Yeah.
for me, yes, and you may remember Tony Grant had the wellbeing engagement framework. It was, where he had on one axis, mental wellbeing from low to high, and then he had performance engagement from low to high, and that top right-hand corner was the combination of high mental health and wellbeing and high performance and engagement, and he called
Mm.
that flourishing or the thriving state. Um, For me, I'm really interested right now more in, I guess, the concept of thriving, but development. And so, and this is where it does get complex because, as you know, with well-being, it's not normal to be happy or even flourishing all the time because depending on what's happening in your life circumstances. So I've lost my two elderly parents in the last 14, 15 months, Jim, which has
Mm,
been one of the most
so sorry.
significant life events for me. And I'm doing okay. I'm grieving, but I'm doing okay. But am I my absolute best self at the moment? Probably not, but we also know that going through these life challenges and that maturity and that growth and development, it does involve struggle and perhaps not elevated levels of well-being at times. So it's a concept that I'm constantly playing with at the moment. I've got, I guess, a more mature way of thinking about it. Um, over the last few years. And I think that is what's happening in the field of positive psych, which in the first wave was very much about positivity and positive emotions. The second wave was more about the holistic understanding that well-being encompasses the full range of human emotions. And the third wave, and we're moving, I believe, towards a fourth wave at the moment, but the third wave is the acknowledgement of the context that we operate in, the systems that we operate in, and the powerful influence that they have on our mental health and well-being.
Hmm. So, if I was to practice gratitude, if I was to develop the habit of mindfulness, being
Yes.
fully present in my life, if I express self compassion, maybe if I set goals that and then monitor my progress towards the goals and aim for um, sort of an optimal challenge, not too
Yes.
challenge to increase anxiety, not so easy as to be boring, but I look for things to draw me in and other things that should help me live a more a more optimal life or to experience more well-being. But well-being isn't necessarily happiness.
Not
We could be
necessarily,
going through a
no.
difficult time, but handle it in a healthy way.
That's right, and Professor Corey Keyes, who you're probably familiar with his work and his early work on the dual continua of well-being, it is a little bit more nuanced. It's not just as we're saying from low to high, and you can still be like there can be. I was, in many ways, I feel privileged to have worked with people early on that were suffering with chronic schizophrenia. Um, but there has been some research to show that once schizophrenia stabilizes, it's not acute and it's more chronic. That there are even applications of positive psychological science like gratitude, like self compassion, that can elevate somebody that perhaps will live for the rest of their life with chronic schizophrenia, but they can still flourish. So it's quite complex. But you're right. I would say that there are many tools and interventions such as the ones you've mentioned, gratitude, mindfulness, self compassion. But I think we need to send the message to hold them lightly. And, for gratitude for some people that are really struggling, it might be a very difficult task to engage in. It can be weaponized. I heard somebody say to me lately, like, you should be grateful, sort of diminishing that person's experience in a sense of somewhat like that toxic positivity. So I think we have a duty to say, yes, there are some wonderful strategies and yes, we can learn them, but it's dependent on the person and the fit between the person and the activity. And it's also dependent on the context that they're operating in now. But again, I'm all for let's give people the tools and then and actually, this is a great point for me to say. I've been making the point lately that coaching for me helps personalize. So if let's say you're at school and you're a kid learning about strengths or self compassion or whatever, if it's taught just like in a class, it's not really personalized or contextualized, but taking a coaching approach, if there's an opportunity, even if it's students peer coaching, if they have the privilege of having some one on one, the coaching then says, okay, tell me what you learned about this week about strengths in class. How might that be relevant to the goals that you're working on right now? Your academic goals, but also perhaps your well-being goals. So coaching for me personalizes and contextualizes well-being science education or performance science education.
Well, I want to come back to coaching. I really want to hear how that works because I think it's kind of hard to do on your own, or maybe it's
Yes,
easier to
it
do with
is.
a coach. But that is to move to a more a more healthier way of living, a more optimal way of living. But
Yes.
you mentioned adult development and
Yes.
trauma and how that plays in. I'd like to hear a bit about that, and then we can talk about coaching.
Yeah, so I think it's part of my own developmental journey, Jim, the older and hopefully wiser you get, but that's not always the case as we as we know. But, within the field of coaching psychology, particularly at Sydney Uni, there's been a strong, I guess, alignment to adult development theories, um, primarily through the work of Professor Robert Keegan, through Sydney University, teach to the theories of Robert Keegan primarily, but there are other theorists within the adult development field. And so when I came across it, I was intrigued because, again, as a psychologist, we learnt developmental psychology, but most of it was from birth or, just pre-birth up until like 12 or even 18. And then it was like, okay, now you're at early adulthood, middle adulthood, and older adulthood and death. It was all, but there was a lot of detail in the early years, but not much in the older years. And so these theorists, they theorize that there are developmental stages that we go through, but a lot of them are around our meaning making of the world and the way that we see the world.
Mhm.
And the later stages, it's not meant to be, better or worse. It's just we all go through these stages. But the later stages of adult development, um, or leadership maturity, because I've been looking at it through the lens of leadership, are able to see the systems. So at the earlier stages, it's either very self-focused, um, and in the sort of the majority of people, though, are in these conventional stages, which are quite black and white. It's either this or that, and quite polarized. And we've seen a lot of that. And of course, social media doesn't help with all the algorithms about polarizing people. I see it on Twitter, X all the time. But these later stages are able, it's a way of seeing the world, and you see the systems and the context, and things aren't as black and white as what we saw them before. And why I've become so interested is is because I only have a handful of senior clients now that I work with, Jim, most of them at the CEO or managing director, GM level. And the reason I want to work with them is because of the power of influence they can have over the people that are in their care on a daily basis. And so my thinking, and I have to just preface this by saying I'm still very much learning about this. I'm not positioning myself as an expert. I'm on a learning journey myself. But from what I can see, we need more leaders, and I would say school leaders, and I'd love to come back to this actually, because I've got some ideas around that in schools. We need more leaders at these later stages that can be more aware of the context and the situation and less black and white in their thinking. So that's an area that as I said, I'm on my learning journey about. But I can tell you, since I've been learning, I've done a course with one of the leading people here in Australia. Since I've done the course, it's like you start looking at people through the lens
Mhm.
of the theory, as I'm sure you've done with other theories in your life, and it's actually given me more compassion for people that are at earlier stages because I've realized I've been at those earlier stages before too, and it's just a different way of seeing the world and making meaning out of the world. So it's been so transformational for me in many ways to start to learn about these theories.
It is fascinating, and Keegan Leahy's work is some of the most influential work I've read in my life, and just in terms of sharing positive information, for example. But okay, so let's say we have this body of literature on
Yes.
positive psychology and moving towards optimal living or greater well-being.
Yes.
It's not necessarily always happy because I think if you're fully present and compassionate, you're
That's
going to
it.
have some painful things to go through, but it's still you're more fully alive and living a better life most likely, or more truer life, more authentic life. So how does coaching help with all of that? How did your interest in positive psychology and your interest in coaching come together?
I think, in my early 20s, my first marriage with, as I mentioned, my ex-husband was a psychiatrist. Went on my own self-development and growth journey. Um, but for me, coaching, and that's what my doctoral research was very much trying to suggest and recommend is, why wait for therapy? I mean, some people have early life circumstances that there's a requirement, but why don't we seek out more proactively coaching around the lives that we want to lead, and to actually carve out time to reflect on our values, what's important to us, who are we, who do we want to be, what sort of life do we want to have. So for me, my executive coaching is very holistic. It's, yes, it's, if typically, if they've engaged through an organization, there are organizational goals that are to be progressed, but the type of coaching I do is very holistic about that whole person's life, and the sense of, particularly with the leaders I'm working with, the responsibility in many ways that they have, as I said, to care and develop in some ways the people within their ecosystem. And I love that. I'm trying to think, it's Peter Hawkins, isn't it? That's talking a lot about at the moment about teams being value creating, not just high performing, which actually probably from an adult development is very conventional, but being high value creating teams and being aware of not just the individual coaching, but the ecosystem that you're operating in and the ripple effect. If I speak to some of that wonderful work by Dr. Sean O'Connor on the coaching ripple effect, and we know that it does ripple out to the people around us.
Hmm. So I've got two more questions. I wish I had more time, but
I know.
maybe we'll do another one. At least when I get
Yay.
to Sydney, for sure, we'll have to carry on the conversation
Yeah.
because I'll be in Australia a lot. But first question would be, and you can just say pass because this is too
Yeah, yeah.
simplistic a question. But the
That's
first question
okay.
would be, um, there's a lot of struggle with well-being right now. So what is something you can give us, some kind of glimmer of hope, something we could do that might
Yeah.
help us move a little bit closer to a better, more optimal living?
And it is a complex question because, again, if I look at I mentioned the legislation, the psych health and safety legislation, and there's an international standard. So there are all countries, and I believe Canada is actually one of the leading countries also in the world. But there's a recognition that well-being, mental health and well-being is a shared responsibility. So there's an individual personal responsibility. So if you're in a school, people still have a personal responsibility, but there's a great growing acknowledgement of the responsibility of the organization or the
Mhm.
educational institution. And so I think one of the things that I'm really grateful that I had the opportunity to do was to work clinically with people, particularly people. I did a lot of workers' compensation treatment, Jim, early on in my career. And so I was aware that even if I equip this person with skills, particularly around reframing, doing some cognitive behavioral therapy, doing some acceptance and commitment, like helping them psychologically, I could get them back to work. But unless that context that they were operating in changed, they weren't going to thrive. So I guess, in terms of the practical work that I've done coaching hundreds of people over the years, um, we need people to flourish and thrive. So I would say, and it's one of my tips, is do your work, like learn all the strategies and skills, because there may be a situation that you're in that you can't leave immediately. You have to pay the bills. You've got a mortgage, you've got kids or whatever. So I've had clients that have said to me, Susie, I know this is toxic, but I can't leave. And so I've said, okay, I can give you some skills that it's going to help you manage, but you're not going to thrive because unless some of these contextual issues change. Now, Jim, you know more about schools than I do. It's not easy to change some of those contextual factors in schools. It's not easy at all. But I think in some ways, particularly here in Australia with that legislation, at least there's a greater recognition and greater conversations happening around what are the things that we could change. Like I'll give you just a quick example by one of my colleagues who I think you've interviewed, Dr. William Dijon. He's an American educator, been living in Australia for a long time. And he is absolutely perplexed why teachers don't have their own classrooms and they run from one classroom to another in senior high school. Um, and he's given me a really strong rationale as to why that could help the educator's well-being in particular by not having to, rush and move and have a safe place. And so, but that's something that, I haven't seen adopted in Australia. There are many other, like actually, I have had another great example when I was working on a large scale positive education program. It was like a 2-year program and it became aware, it became, um, it was recognized that if the goal was for the educators to spend time, particularly the mentors or the tutors, if you like, if it was recognized that it was important for them to have eyes on their group, their house group or their home group every single day, they realized that they weren't, that because of the timetable, that they didn't have eyes on those kids every single day. And so the principal in that moment, when he realized that, said, bring in the timetabler. And so I don't know if you've never met timetablers. I'm sure it's all happening by AI now, but they're very interesting people because I think they must be able to just think like incredibly systemically. And so the timetabler came in and it happened in real time, the changing of the timetable, because they realized that if they wanted to create thriving teachers and thriving students, the timetable wasn't supportive of that. So I think, and I've just read a beautiful book you're probably familiar with over the last couple of years, Thrive by Valerie Hannon. Incredible book, which talks about the transformation of education into the 21st century and beyond. And she also talks about the importance of us acknowledging that it's an all hands on deck scenario on our planet right now, and that well-being is important. So is climate change. And so I think in education, we've been talking about it for a long time about some significant transformations that need to happen. And as the hopeful optimist, Jim, I hope we're on our way. I do, see examples of that happening, but we've still got a way to go, I would say.
Okay, sadly, my last question is, have you got a idea, a question, a strategy, a tip, a bit of advice, maybe one or two things that you
Yeah.
could share with coaches to help them be more effective as they coach? Because a lot of our audience are coaches.
Absolutely. Well, I would say first and foremost, do your own work. Like, well, first of all, when I was doing my doctorate on coaching, I engaged a coach because I thought, if I'm going to be working on coaching, I need to have a coach. So if you've never had a coach, never had your own experience of coaching, absolutely do that. But I would go a bit further. And particularly, I'm speaking to coaches that are more in the developmental, transformational realm. And as you know, we often differentiate coaching for skills, coaching for performance, and then coaching for development transformation. But if you're going to, create a profession out of this and you do want to move beyond and into that developmental space, it's so important that you do your own work. Go and have therapy because, and Brené Brown has said this, I can't quite repeat it as she has, but, rather than putting your stuff onto other people, go and do the work on yourself so you can understand what's mine, what is others. And that's crucially important when you're coaching people. I would say ongoing supervision. I still have an incredibly wise, experienced supervisor that I see, and I always come away with insights, particularly around my client work. But when it comes to positive psych, I would suggest that people, are curious and lean in, and it has evolved, from those early days. It's not about being happy all the time. And I will, if it's okay, give a quick plug. I do have 2 edited books, one on positive psychology coaching in practice with Professor Stephen Palmer, and I have another one with Professor Alona Boniwell and Wendy Smith called Positive Psychology Coaching in the Workplace. And in those edited books, there's chapters by really interesting people on different aspects of positive psych, like mindfulness in coaching, for example, or positive leadership in an evidence-based coaching context. There's so much that we can learn, particularly around the cultivation of hope and optimism, which coaching really is a hope enhancement intervention. I've done 2 randomized controlled trials to prove that, Jim. But one of Tony's papers, and I haven't got the year of it, one of his later papers that he published, I think it was with Sean O'Connor, it was comparing, you might be familiar with this study, was comparing problem-focused coaching, solution-focused coaching, positive affect induction, where they put people into a positive mood state, and then a combined solution-focused and positive affect induction. And it was the combined one that had the biggest impact on self-efficacy, goal approach, and action steps. So we need the solution focus is how we define coaching anyway. We need that. But you can see if you bring in some ways of enhancing positive emotions, and that double whammy of solution focused positive affect is going to give you a stronger outcome, hopefully, in your coaching.
I love it. I think it's wonderful. And I think what you're doing is you're helping us see a bigger picture of the potential of coaching. And I'm with you. I would say coaches foster hope. That's really the essence of what they do. Um,
Yes.
I'm just grateful for you, Susie. I always try to learn something or a lot. I've learned a lot,
Yeah.
but the thing I'm most grateful for is this new name, Susie Sunshine. So I'm so grateful for you, Susie, and grateful for the chance to learn with you. I look forward to the next conversation.
Oh, thank you so much, Jim. You do such incredible work, and it's been a privilege getting to know you and continue to connect with you. Thank you.
Thanks.